From as far back as the medieval days of our history, skeletons have been found with iron stakes driven into their chests. Skulls have been discovered with stones and bricks placed into their mouths. This exorcism technique was once believed to keep the corpses from eating their way out of the grave. Throughout the 17th to 18th century, belief in vampires was rife in several places worldwide. Stories emerged from Eastern Europe of those that had borne witness to the undead, understanding the incorruptibility of a corpse as evidence that the apparent dead were, in fact, vampiric. They noted that after several months, sometimes even years in a grave, bodies were found with blood still in a liquid state, whilst the flesh remained intact. As much as it may seem to ring the bell of tall tales, what these witnesses had claimed to have seen was, in fact, true. They had mistaken the science behind what was occurring with supernatural reasoning. Saponification is a process that occurs when a body is buried in a cold, damp environment, something that would not be a rarity in Eastern Europe. During this process, the body's fatty acids would turn into a waxy, soap-like compound that covers the corpse, preventing decay. Another observation that proved the vampire's existence upon a grave was when body hair and fingernails continued to grow even after death. This misunderstanding continues to this day, with some believing our hair and nails continue to grow after our passing. In reality, what is occurring is the dehydration of skin, causing it to retract from hair follicles and nails, giving the impression that they were still growing in their tombs. We look back on those times when we were scientifically illiterate with an element of playful judgment, understanding just how little they knew and what far-fetched conclusions they had come to in their quest to understand what was unfolding before them. It is easy to dismiss this illogical and overly suspicious behavior as nothing but the actions of our ignorant ancestors. Such a thing could not happen in today's society. Could it? My name is Luke Mordew, and this urban legend is the Highgate Vampire. Gothic tales of dark creatures living amongst the streets of London have existed further back than the 18th century. The undead has risen in many forms throughout human history, and at no point has the fascination with them ever truly waned. Whether it be zombies, Frankenstein's creation, vampires, ghouls, or ghosts, the undead has, somewhat ironically, remained alive. If we were to talk about those that truly believe in the existence of vampires in our modern world, I feel that it's fair to say that many of us would find the notion slightly far-fetched and strange. Although it is only when you genuinely dissect this that the hypocrisy of the notion begins to show its face. I may not believe in ghosts or spirits, and I mean no disrespect when I say that although it is yet to hold any hard evidence, many of you who are listening to me right now believe in their existence regardless. To take a step back away from that faith, to look at it through the eyes of somebody who does not believe in the afterlife, we must ask ourselves how different it truly is to believe in one form of the dead's return and not another. My point is not to mock or play down the beliefs of any listeners. It is merely to emphasize an understanding as to why members of the British public raided Highgate Cemetery in London in search of a vampire. Many will find it shocking to learn that this happened in the 1970s. When we hear descriptions of a vampire hunt, we often imagine Victorian-era garments and wooden stakes. Although on this occasion, it was very much a world that we still recognize today that believed a vampire was lurking amongst the shadows of the tombs. In my telling of a fictionalized event on the grounds of Highgate Cemetery, we will follow Adrian, who is taking a walk through the picturesque landscape of the grounds. The snow crunched under Adrian's feet as he walked down the concrete path of the large cemetery. The fluffiness of the settled snow had frozen away overnight, leaving it now hard and dust-like, as its crystallized whiteness sparkled under the bright winter sun above. The skies were blue and bitter, leaving a sharp cold to fill the air as he strolled through the area. He lifted the phone he held in his cold hands and took several photographs of a beautiful stone sculpture that stood proudly above a grave by the trees to his left. The atmosphere and architecture of this area were as beautiful and gothic as he had always imagined them to be. Ever since his childhood back in Romania, he had found himself drawn to the stories that surrounded the city of London. He had been here since the summer, but due to his workload, he hadn't had a chance to see London correctly. Not in the way he had always dreamed. There had been many bars, a few clubs, and some of the more obvious tourist attractions. But this was a place he had heard about and wanted to see with his own eyes for many years now. And on this snowy winter day, he had finally allowed himself this treat. He looked down at the picture he had just taken, choosing his favourite to send back home to his mum, when a strange sound echoed from the greenery behind, almost as if a branch had snapped from its trunk. He turned, looking out into the trees that surrounded him. This was not a busy day at the cemetery, and he had not seen another person since he had arrived at the entrance. This place was far more extensive than he had ever imagined, and he found the isolation it gave him somewhat comforting, allowing him to just be himself, admiring all around. But this strange sound caught him off guard. He looked up at the long path behind him that turned off and disappeared out of sight. But there was nothing there. He looked at the trees on his left. Nothing. He turned to his right. Also nothing. He wasn't concerned at all. It was just a large, sudden snap close by, and it seemingly given him a spook, putting his mind momentarily into the gears of fight or flight. He looked down at his phone again and opened his previous messages to his mum, sending her the pictures he had just taken as he began to follow the path once more, feeling boastful and proud that he was able to share his travels with her. He smirked and sniggered, giving himself a mindful word with, "You're here. You made it." And with this, he looked up to continue his journey. But now he was startled again. This time, stopping him in his tracks. Ahead, nearer the end of the long path, was now standing a tall, older man in what looked to be a grey suit. He must have been freezing in the cold air, not wrapped in gloves, a coat or a scarf. That said, it was as if the curious man was frozen, doing nothing but staring into the deep thickness of trees just off the path to the right. This man standing in the middle of the pathway seemed to come from nowhere. Adrian had just scanned the entire area and had seen nobody. How on earth could this old man appear so fast? Adrian didn't think much more of it, assuming he had clearly just not seen this man during his previous scan, or that there was a turning ahead he could not yet see. And so he continued to walk. After these first few steps, Adrian expected this curious old man to come closer into view. Although, no matter how far he walked, the grey man seemed to remain at the same distance. The man must have been walking along the path in the same direction as him. That's what Adrian thought. Although, something about even this felt strange. And so he stopped walking. As he expected, but hoped to be wrong about, the grey man also stopped at that very moment, still standing just as he had before, staring out into the trees. Did Adrian misunderstand the situation? Was something playing tricks on his mind? Or was this man himself trying to mess with him? He didn't know. The problem itself was low-key, although he couldn't help but feel an element of dread slithering under his skin at the sight of the grey man ahead. Adrian sighed, telling himself not to be so stupid, being wary of an old man simply admiring nature. He stepped forward again, still keeping his eyes fixated on the grey figure ahead, his mind taken away from the gothic beauty that surrounded him. And the grey man began to move also. This was becoming too strange for Adrian now. This could not be a coincidence. This figure of a man is ensuring he remains in sight but far away. And that was when Adrian noticed something. The thing that seemed so off about this grey figure, so unsettling and strange. The man's legs were not moving, yet he could stroll away quickly. It was as if the figure was not even touching the ground, simply floating above the earth's surface. Adrian paused again, needing to take a moment to clearly see what he thought he could see, and sure enough, the grey man stopped with him. Adrian began to think of several alternatives to what he believed he could see down the long path. Perhaps he was on wheels of some sort, like a skateboard, although that in itself was no less ridiculous to him. Most likely, he told himself, his mind had misunderstood what his eyes had seen due to the cold, the white snowy floors, and the distance. Although in his heart, he did not believe this as accurate, as he stared ahead at the grey figure that remained motionless. His phone buzzed in his hand, causing a sudden vibration to shoot through his arm, giving him an intense fright, almost yelping like a dog who had just had its tail stepped on. He looked down at the phone to see a message from his mum that simply read, "Looks beautiful." He smiled at the message before looking back up at the grey figure again. But to his surprise, it was gone. The nervousness he felt was lessened by the sudden disappearance of the figure, although it had not dissipated entirely, as now he had no idea what or where it was. He paced down the pathway, no longer admiring the statues and tombs around him, now focusing on getting somewhere a little less isolated. He passed the area he had last witnessed the grey man, studying the floor and space around him. But he found nothing, not even footsteps in the snow. He refused to think about what this could mean, and instead picked up pace as he headed towards comfort. The area had seemed greyer and darker in the shadow of the treetops that blocked the bright sun above. That said, Adrian knew that this could have easily been due to the change in his perception of the area. He arrived at a turning in the pathway and cut across the snow-covered grass to shorten the journey as much as possible, listening as it crunched beneath his feet. He headed around the trees and bushes, following the path that he hoped would eventually lead him to the entrance once again. His eyes continued to dart around him, listening to the wind that blew gently through the treetops, like the sounds of a million tiny whispers. He partly hoped to see the grey figure again, so he could see that it was nothing but an elderly man in a suit, and nothing to be afraid of. Mostly, though, he hoped to never witness his presence again. He turned, heading through an even more enclosed area as he arrived at the catacombs that sat in all their macabre beauty under the dead winter trees above. He slowed his pace, releasing a breath of relief into the cold air, watching the condensation exhale from his mouth and dance in front of his face as he did. He now knew where he was and where he needed to go to get out. And very quickly, the fear he had momentarily felt had left him, and he felt relaxed and safe once again, comforted by the recognition he felt within the area. He turned and began to walk towards the path that led to the cemetery's exit. But as he did, something caught his eye through his peripherals. He stopped, wanting to run, but desperate to prove that he was merely hallucinating or confused. This was unfortunately not the case. Something he soon realized as he turned his head towards the catacombs. Under the arch of the doorway across from him were two dimly lit glowing eyes, watching him from the shadows inside. His breath instantly left his body as if it had been sucked out of him. He observed the long, pale, grey fingers of a human-like hand slowly emerge from the darkness, creeping their long nails and fingertips around the stone of the doorway. Even without his breath, Adrian spun on the spot and darted towards the trees ahead. He charged around the curve of the catacombs until he arrived beside the graves again. The windy air seemed to fill with the sounds of hungry voices seeping through the wind from below. How he knew they were coming from the graves around him, he had no idea, but they were, as the earth around several graves began to shake and twist. He charged through the trees as fast as he could, horrified by how many headstones there were, even here, as he passed numerous ancient graves that had been left and forgotten amongst nature. Once he reached a point where the whispers of the dead had subsided, he decided to stop, crouching down and slamming his back against an old, worn-out stone chest tomb to hide his shaking body from the direction of the catacombs. He needed to stop. He was exhausted and drained, his mind filled with so many thoughts it was now nothing but static. If he kept moving forward, who's to say he wasn't going deeper? If he was to go back, who's to say he wasn't walking to his death? He didn't know what to do, and he needed to decide, and quickly. He slowly lifted his head, peering his eyes over the top of the chest tomb to look out onto the catacombs behind, pushing his bare hand into the cold snow on the floor, uncaring of the bitterness of the sensation. The catacombs sat silently and peaceful, as if nothing had happened at all. This did little to comfort him though, as now he had realized this figure could come and go as it pleased. Something moved through the bushes ahead of him, causing him to spin on the spot, slamming his back against the chest tomb once again as he studied the brown branches that now swayed as if something had just brushed past them with speed. He remained still, unable to ignore the horrible realization that he was not only being hunted, but toyed with alongside it. His breathing was so hot and heavy that his breath created a mist-like effect in front of his eyes, slightly obstructing his view. This only unnerved and frustrated him further as he pondered what to do with every pant. He closed his eyes, taking a slow, deep breath to control his breathing once again, clearing his mind so he could make an intelligent decision on what his next move should be. He immediately felt better, clearer, able. But the moment he opened his eyes, things changed as he noticed the air was still full of cold breath dissipating into the air. But this breath was not his. From above the stone tomb behind him, just over his shoulder, he began to hear the intense, harsh breathing of another, growing faster and heavier with every beat, almost weeping in its excitement as the hunter finally stopped playing with its food. To the guests at the front entrance that were now entering the ice and snow-covered grounds of Highgate Cemetery, the sounds of Adrian's tortured screams were distant and faded. They were inaudible to anyone who could help, merging with the cold winter winds until they quietened to silence. The last sounds that Adrian would ever make. Tales of the things that go bump in the night are not a rarity in our culture. Scary stories and beliefs in those tales go back hundreds of years, most likely back to the days of the first stories, when early humanity would share the darkness through word of mouth. Some creatures, such as vampires, mummies, and werewolves, are so ingrained in our societies that the ability to induce fear has seemingly left them. These monstrous beings have evolved to become love interests, anti-heroes, or titular characters in action movies. We see them now as almost as fairy tale creatures to appear in the darker stories we share, some even wishing they could live out their lives in the shadow of their character, trying to bring the notions of their existence into the real world. If you were to claim you saw a ghost on cemetery grounds, some would not believe you. But many would, as they accepted the strange understanding of spirits walking the earth. If you instead claimed that you bore witness to a vampire, the reactions would differ entirely, now believing you to either be a liar or delusional. This was not always the case. There was once a time when the fear of vampires was genuine in certain corners of the world, but this belief has seemingly faded into the shadow as our scientific knowledge grows. This is why it was considered such a strange tale when rumors began to spread about a vampire haunting Highgate Cemetery grounds. Strangely, the first evidence of any vampiric goings-on amongst North London in England was almost 2 years before the legend had truly begun. It was on the night of Halloween in 1968 that unknown persons desecrated part of Tottenham Park Cemetery. Whomever it was had arranged flowers taken from other graves and placed them in a circular pattern with arrows of blooms pointing to a newer grave, one that had been uncovered. Inside the coffin, authorities would find that the body inside had been disturbed, with the strangest and darkest act being the cross-shaped iron stake pierced through the lid and into the corpse's chest. The identities and motivations of whoever committed this horrible act were never discovered. Little did the public know that vampires were yet to re-emerge amongst the people of North London until the residents sat down to read Hampstead and Highgate Express on the 6th of February, 1970. Inside, a man named David Farrant, a Wiccan priest who at times served as the president of the Psychic and Occult Society, had written a letter to the paper. He claimed he passed the Highgate Cemetery 2 months prior, on the 24th of December, 1969. He claims he had glimpsed what he described as a grey figure. He added that he considered this grey figure supernatural, asking if anyone else had experienced or seen anything similar. On the 13th of February, several people replied to his letter. They described a variety of ghost-like sightings that were said to haunt the cemetery or the adjoined Swains Lane. These spirits were described as a tall man in a hat, the usual woman in white, a cyclist, a figure wading into a pond, a pale gliding form, and a face grimacing through the bars of a gate. The letters also described strange sounds alongside the sightings, such as bells ringing in the air and voices calling from the shadow. At this time, it is said, although not confirmed, that the corpses of several animals were found around the cemetery. Their bodies had been drained of blood and with what appeared to be lacerations to their throat. Although this does seem like a later addition implanted into the history of the legend. The cemetery was not what it is known to be today, very much a tourist attraction with guided tours around the grounds and a souvenir shop at the entrance. Back in the 1970s, the now carefully maintained graves and pathways were neglected and left to their own devices. The greenery was overgrown and chaotic. Vandalism was rife on the grounds, and stories of pagan sex parties were known to spread amongst the locals. Doors had been pulled from vaults. Wide cracks had appeared from years of neglect and decay in the sides of the tombs, allowing glimpses at the coffins and corpses inside. This was a place to avoid for many, rather than a tourist destination for people to visit and admire. The setting itself was a macabre, spooky place filled with gothic imagery and grand monuments. A perfect landscape for scary stories about spirits, the undead, and the occult. After his letter and the replies that it received, David Farrant would claim that he had spoken to two separate people. One was an older woman who had been out walking her dog. The second was a middle-aged accountant. He claimed that both reportedly shared similar stories to him of what they had seen on the grounds of Highgate Cemetery. The older woman was reportedly walking down Swains Lane, a road that runs through the graveyard. She claimed to feel the air turn icy cold here before witnessing a tall, dark figure ahead with glaring eyes floating towards her with intent. The middle-aged accountant reportedly told a similar story, explaining that he had gotten lost in the vast landscape of the cemetery. Here, he heard the clanging of a bell and began to walk towards it, hoping it would guide him to a place he could gather his bearings. But as he did, he became aware of something lurking behind him, noticing the temperature was plummeting fast. He turned to witness a tall, dark figure that stared at him intensely before it vanished into the thin air. Farrant claims that it was due to this that he decided to investigate the cemetery by spending a night there. During this night amongst the graves, he said he caught sight of a figure. He described it as being 7 feet tall, appearing to float just above the ground, with its eyes being 2 points of intense red light. He said the air had turned icy cold, as if he had stepped into a refrigerator, and he felt his energy draining as if it was sucking the essence from within him, causing him to lose control of his normal faculties. He described it as a vivid dream and wanted to wake up, but could not. He would later say that he realized he was under intense psychic attack, causing him to repeatedly react with a Kabbalistic incantation in his mind to repel the evil forces. He seemed to think this worked, claiming that the being disappeared at that moment. It is here that our tale takes a turn for the stranger, as another man appeared in conjecture to the being of Highgate Cemetery. A local man interested in the supernatural had kept a keen eye on the letters written in the Hampstead and Highgate Express. He eventually decided to contact them with his ideas on what was happening. On the 27th of February 1970, only a couple of weeks after the first letter by David Farrant, the newspaper ran an interview with the young man, where he explained his ideas. You see, this young man, named Sean Manchester, did not believe that this grey being was a spirit, but that it was actually a vampire. The interview headline was titled, "Does a Vampire Walk in Highgate?" It seems clear that the reporters at the newspaper were having a bit of tongue-in-cheek fun regarding the situation, but the subjects at hand took it very seriously. Sean would explain that this being was a king vampire of the undead, buried in the cemetery. He said that this vampire, who had in life been an aristocrat and practitioner of black magic in medieval Romania, had been transported to England in a coffin by his followers in the early 18th century. Not only that, but the vampire lived on the grounds of the cemetery, and even lived in a house that its followers had purchased for it in London's West End. He suggested that the vampire had reappeared due to the rituals that Satanists had recently carried out in the cemetery, reawakening the evil. He had interviews to back up his ideas as well, claiming that he had spoken to several local people who had experienced vampiric activity, although, in Sean Manchester's case, those that reportedly witnessed it were able to come forward and confirm. One eyewitness testimony was that of a schoolgirl named Elizabeth Wojtyla. She claimed to be walking down Swains Lane when she witnessed a vampire ahead of her. Later, she would describe nightmares that she had been cursed with, dreaming of something evil trying to enter her bedroom. Eventually, things would take a step further, as she would claim to have found 2 wounds on her neck before beginning to show symptoms of anemia. Her boyfriend at the time contacted Sean Manchester, knowing him to be a self-proclaimed exorcist, vampire hunter, and bishop of the Old Catholic Church, and explained what had happened. He and Sean filled her room with garlic, crucifixes, and holy water. And this seemed to do the trick, or so the tale claims, as Elizabeth's condition soon improved. It is worth noting that Sean Manchester could not supply any proof to his claims that the vampire had come from Eastern Europe, and would later state this section of the article to be nothing but a journalistic embellishment. Although, in the book that he would later release on the subject, he does mention a foreign nobleman's coffin being brought to Highgate once again. These stories from both men's side are objectively fantastical and large in scale, and it is safe to say that most took it all with a pinch of salt. Although, not everyone. One part of these out there stories that are seemingly true was the part that mentions ceremonies going on inside the gates of Highgate Cemetery. Even David Farrant, who quickly became somewhat of a rival to Sean Manchester, agreed that he had found discarded remains of satanic rituals, such as stubs of black candles and satanic markings on the floor of tombs. He had even found inverted pentagrams drawn within a small chapel-like tomb he had found. I am not suggesting that there are not those out there who believe in the devil, those who ritualize this worship in an attempt to release or contact them. However, whenever I see a pentagram, a ram skull, a black candle, or anything else that many deem to be satanic, my mind instantly takes me back to the kids I knew at school who found comfort in nonconformity. I would even see devil-like symbols and writings. After all, it's not like the idea of a goth phase is unheard of. These markings may very well have been a serious ritual amongst devil worshippers, or they may have simply been edgy teenagers looking to excite themselves in a world they deemed unfitting. It is also worth pointing out that David Farrant himself admitted to being a member of a group that used the same cemetery for rituals. However, his were pagan Wicca rather than anything of a satanic nature. Although he would firmly push that his group never interfered with any graves at all, simply using the space as his rituals needed to be outdoors. And this was the secluded open space that nobody alive was using. The Hampstead and Highgate Express continued to follow the vampire story as it progressed, eventually re-interviewing both David Farrant and Sean Manchester several times over the following months. During this time, the stories of animals being drained of blood emerged for the first time. Farrant was far less keen to label the being, whilst Manchester was confident in his claim that it was in fact a vampire. That said, even David Farrant admitted that this being could indeed be vampiric, and this, as history shows us, is what stuck. At this point, it is fair to say that the birth of this urban legend was very much down to 2 men and 2 men alone, with nobody else genuinely getting involved in the hunt for the Highgate Vampire. That was until the 2 men appeared on television, when things quickly got deeply and historically out of hand. If you're still with me, then I know you share the same passion for folklore and urban legends that drives this show. But to keep bringing you these stories, I need your help. Every season comes to life with the incredible support of listeners like you on Patreon. For just £3 a month, less than the price of a small coffee, you can help ensure that this show continues to thrive.
with shorter breaks between seasons and even more content available. But that's not all. As a Patreon subscriber, you'll unlock exclusive perks like access to our bonus series, Modern Myths, where we dive into lesser known but equally captivating tales like the Hodag, Black-Eyed Children, the Dark Watchers, and many more. You'll gain instant access to our entire library of bonus content the moment you join, with new chapters coming each season. You'll also get a behind-the-scenes look at how the show is made, discounts on merchandise, and an invitation to our private group chat, where you can connect with me directly and share your love for urban legends with a community of like-minded enthusiasts. Plus, as a special treat, I randomly select patrons to feature in upcoming stories, so you might find yourself becoming part of the very legends we explore. Supporting us on Patreon isn't just about subscribing. It's about joining a team dedicated to preserving and expanding on our collection of folklore. Your contribution directly fuels the research, production, and growth of the show, helping us continue this incredible journey together. So, if you're ready to take the next step and become an integral part of the Urban Legends community, head over to our Patreon page via the link in our show notes and choose the paid subscription. I'm looking forward to seeing you there, where we can keep these tales alive. And now, back to the legend.
David Farrant and Sean Manchester were locally famous for their wild speculations, fantastical claims, and curious ways of being. But although they both are equally responsible for the urban legend of the Highgate Vampire, they did not seem to get on at all. Very rarely would the chance to attack the other's character be ignored, with the two creating a rivalry between themselves, something the newspaper fed into with much glee. The then editor of the Hampstead and Highgate Express would later admit that they consistently played the story for laughs. They found the idea of two men believing to have somewhat magical powers, flinging verbal abuse at each other, highly entertaining and fascinating. Both men were characters, to say the least, with Sean Manchester claiming that he was a direct descendant of Lord Byron, the man who is coincidentally said to be the inspiration for several vampire tales. According to criminal investigator Don Ecker, his claims did not end here, even going as far as to suggest he was related to King Arthur. Sean Manchester was a man who took his job seriously and was very rarely seen without his vampire hunting kit by his side. It was not long before ITV News had gotten in touch with the men, arguably being the biggest channel in the UK behind the BBC. This was an excellent opportunity for the two men to share their thoughts, ideas, and claims. On the Friday the 13th of March, 1970, Sean Manchester announced on television that he would perform an exorcism to destroy the vampire once and for all. The show featured Sean, David Farrant, and others who had claimed to witness the strange goings-on behind the cemetery gates, even reporting on a live feed from the gates themselves. It was undoubtedly a bit of fun for the television channel, but seemingly very important for the two men at the center of the tale. Although, this bit of fun took a surprising turn when, within hours of the show's air, a mob of individuals arrived from every corner of London to enter the cemetery. The sudden arrival of the hunters was shocking, confusing, and strange, and yet the numbers continued to roll in. The police were present, but much of the mob still managed to get over the fences. The size of the cemetery was far too large for the forces to gatekeep. And now, the hunt was on in the shadows of the night of Friday the 13th. Many of the would-be hunters carried weapons as they ventured through the dangerous terrain of the cemetery at night, searching through every Victorian tomb and grave sites they could find amongst the overgrown shrubberies that resided there. Those interviewed by the television crews and newspaper journalists seemed to believe more in the vampire's existence than not, asserting their determination to end the creature's evil ways. And whilst all this was happening on the outskirts of the cemetery, it is reported that inside the shadow of the tombs, Sean Manchester and his trusted companions entered a particular catacomb. Sean claimed that he had previously been led to this tomb by a sleepwalking girl who had witnessed the Highgate Vampire. The group could not open the door, resulting in them having to use a rope to climb down into the catacomb through a window. Inside, they found several coffins, one of which they claimed was out of place with the others, being a sinister-looking coffin made with dark, almost black wood. They went forward with the exorcism, pouring holy water and garlic around them with a sprinkle of salt. No vampire was ever caught that night, although several would-be hunters did claim to bear witness to the being. David Farrant was not best pleased with the theatrics of this night, claiming that the media hysteria and local superstition had turned the Highgate entity into a vampire, a being that he still did not believe that it was. The mass hysteria that had erupted through the city of London came and went in an instant. If you were to now look up urban legends within the confines of the city, the Highgate Vampire would likely be amongst them. And yet, its very existence was short-lived, and its belief amongst most disappeared along with it. It is an urban legend that exists only to be remembered as an urban legend amongst the city's communities, with many barely remembering its existence. The scenario became stranger a few months later, on the 1st of August, 1970. Near the catacombs on the grounds of the cemetery, a woman's charred, decapitated remains were found, bringing a significant element of darkness and seriousness to the last bit of fun amongst the papers. The body was not a murder, with its corpse over a century old. It was macabre and unsettling, a horrific disrespect to a resting body. However, the reason for it was never confirmed to be connected to the Highgate Vampire in any way, although it is not a stretch to see a connection. Just why and by whom this occurred was never discovered and will never be known. The whole situation of the Highgate Vampire seems to be a strange bookmark in the pages of everyday lives of Londoners. Only a small group of people even believed in the entity, two of whom were consistently hunting for it, and their movements on the grounds picked up the pace significantly after the discovery of the corpse. Sure that this was not a vampire, David Farrant decided to attempt to communicate with it instead, to discover its purpose. He and the group gathered in the cemetery. They conducted rituals using 2 circles, incense, candles, and a medium. Although this first attempt was squandered by the arrival of the media, who were still interested in keeping the tale alive. The second time was once things had died down, a year later. According to Farrant, a second attempt led to the entity grabbing the medium at the throat, forcing them to break the circle. To Farrant, this was no vampire, but a malignant presence that haunted the area. Even so, Farrant still found himself arrested whilst on cemetery grounds, holding famous vampire-killing tools, such as a crucifix and a wooden stake. The police were more cautious after all that had happened, now suspicious and disturbed by the arrival of a charred corpse. The 2 men were now seen as loons against a backdrop of Highgate due to these darker elements. David Farrant would even go on to sue the now defunct News of the World newspaper for their suggestion that he was a would-be cat killer. During this time, Sean Manchester continued onward with his vampire hunt, now being led to a different family vault by a psychic helper. Once they forced open the doors, they were greeted by a black coffin again, leading Sean to speculate that its black magic devotees had perhaps moved it. During this time, Sean Manchester continued onward with his vampire hunt, now being led to a different family vault by a psychic helper. Once they forced open the doors, they were greeted by a black coffin again, leading Sean to speculate that its black magic devotees had perhaps moved it. It was here that Sean claims he levered open the lid and saw what he would explain as the horrific continents of what was inside, that we had absolute confirmation on what we were dealing with. The story they would tell claimed that Sean wanted to stake the body, but a member of his entourage persuaded him not to, as interfering with remains was a crime in England. And so instead, they opted to perform a ritual. The public defamation of each other's characters continued forward and would continue until the day that David Farrant died at the age of 73 in the April of 2019. Although it is worth noting that Sean Manchester did write a heartfelt eulogy for his old foe. Publicity on the two had momentarily re-sparked in 1974 when rumours began to spread that the two would be meeting for what was being touted as a magician's duel on Parliament Hill on Friday the 13th of April 1973. However, before it could go ahead, it seemed the men cooled down and called off the duel. They would continuously write and speak about the events of the Highgate Vampire until even now, each bigging up their role to the extent that it minimalized and excluded the other from the narrative. Merlin Coverley, the author of Occult London, is quoted as saying, "If you remove their involvement from the story, there is not a great deal left. They really are the story, and the Highgate Vampire is merely the set of circumstances which brought them together." The two continue to live as two sides of the same coin, continuously attempting to one-up each other and do things their way. David Farrant had presided over the British Psychic and Occult Society, whilst Sean Manchester founded the similar, but different, British Occult Society. Even years later, in 1985, Sean Manchester released a book called The Highgate Vampire, where many of his accounts of the events are pulled from. 6 years later, in 1991, David Farrant gave his side a go, releasing a book titled Beyond the Highgate Vampire. Unfortunately for David Farrant, he had spent some time between the events and the book release in prison, being charged with grave desecration in 1974. He disputed this charge until his eventual death, saying that it was the work of Satanists rather than him. Although it is not hard to understand why the police, the judge, and the jury found this hard to believe. Although he did admit to sending voodoo effigies to 2 police officers. In that same year of 1974, Sean Manchester had an adventure of his own. He would later claim that his ritual helped for a short time, but that the supernatural horrors that came with the Highgate Vampire had returned. He apparently found the black coffin once again, this time in the cellars of an abandoned Gothic mansion on the borders of Highgate and Crouch End. He shared his belief that the vampire had been moved here to keep it safe after the knowledge had gotten out regarding its existence amongst the tombs of Highgate Cemetery. He lifted the lid and saw what he described as even more distorted than I remembered it. Far worse than even that time in the Highgate vault. Its burning, fierce eyes under the many furrowed brows were staring, yellow at the edges with blood-red centers, unlike anything imaginable. Here, he claimed to have finally drove a stake into the heart of the Highgate Vampire. To this day, Sean Manchester works as an exorcist and bishop of the British Old Catholic Church, and now claims that he has destroyed several vampiric creatures in his lifetime. That said, David Farrant never believed that the Highgate Vampire was gone, never seeing it as a vampire to begin with. On top of that are several sightings of tall, dark figures floating above the ground with burning eyes that have been reported from the 1990s until this very day, suggesting that perhaps the legend of the Highgate Vampire will rise again.
Urban Legends is researched, written and produced by Luke Mordew. Original score by Billy Jupp, with additional sounds from storyblocks.com. If you like what you heard and want to hear more, click subscribe on your chosen podcast provider and delve into the mysteries of our previous and future chapters. To find more, including merchandise, video content, images, and more, visit urbanlegendsfolklore.com. If you have more information or a correction on something mentioned in this chapter, please get in touch through our website. We aim to ensure that all information provided is accurate and up to date, and this remains a top priority. If you want to support the show, receive early access, and have more of a say in what we do, then become a patron by clicking the link in our show notes. For these chapters in video format, simply search Urban Legends Folklore on YouTube. Follow us on TikTok, Instagram, and Threads, and join our Facebook group by searching Urban Legends Folklore.